Hey, what's going on, guys? Coach Connor here with another episode of the 10-Minute Strength Pod, and today we're going to be talking about in-season considerations for your programming. So it's October. A lot of fall seasons have already started. We also have fall ball and club lacrosse has started down here. Hockey's in full swing. We're in the middle of football season, so a lot of sports have kind of already started. So a lot of you may be wondering how you should be programming this time of year, and today we're going to talk about that. Before we get into that, I know in the last episode I mentioned that we're going to be kind of changing platforms and names for this podcast. So right now we're between the Strength Coach Institute and Strength Coach University as to where we're going to host it. I own both domains, trying to figure out which one's going to be a better fit. If you have, if you have an opinion, let me know. But that's where we're at right now. As of right now, the tentative new name for the podcast will be Strength Coach Rants. But we'll see. I don't know. A lot of times I'll change my mind last minute because something sounds better or whatever. If I have a couple minutes to sit and think about it, it may change. But as of right now, that's kind of the path we're heading down, and we're looking to hopefully have parts of that website open and running, operational, come like the second week in November. So that's that. We're going to talk about in-season programming today. So with everything kind of starting up, season's gearing up right now, you're making that transition from kind of off-season to even pre-season to your in-season training right now. And there's a lot of different nuances to how this is going to, how you're going to have to program and what's going to matter within this. And today we're going to go over all those different things. What changes during the season, right? Like training is training. What aspects of your training really need to change, or I guess what forces change within your programming due to being in season. And the first one's going to be your goals, right? So we have athletes who are still developing strength and athletes who are well-seasoned, higher training age, who need to kind of maintain strength. And I hate to say maintain. It's a dangerous word. I don't really think that there's a way to maintain anything. I think we're either kind of heading in the right direction or we're backtracking. So when I say maintenance, I mean like very, very small steps as opposed to like the bigger steps that we're going to take with our athletes with lower training ages. So like your goals, right? What the sport does to you, we've got to undo, right? So a lot of the offseason, your athletes aren't out on the field to play. They're not creating damage in the same way that they're going to be doing during the season. And, for instance, I'll go back to hockey because that's kind of my wheelhouse. During the hockey season, because of all the skating that they're doing, we're going to see a lot more kind of hip flexor tightness, a lot more groin tightness, a lot more piriformis and TFL tightness. So those are things that have to be you have to be mindful of those, and we have to undo some of that before we get into the gym. So under the bar and actually training. So you're going to have to be a lot more mindful of that, pay a lot of attention to detail when it comes to their mobility. You may end up spending a lot more time than you want on these things, but like I said, we have to undo some of what the game does to them. The preparedness of your athletes is going to change day by day. It always does. I mean, preparedness changes minute by minute, to be completely honest. But during the season, there's going to be a lot more of this, right? So you may have something planned. Your athlete may come in, didn't get any sleep because they were up doing homework all night because they had practice till 9 or 10 o'clock at night, got home, had to do homework, study for a test that they had the next day, and they got like 4 hours of sleep. Now what do we do, right? We have to make these adjustments. It's not typical that we have to do those things in the off season nearly as often as we have to during the season. Recovery times for athletes. You're going to have to plan in an effort to have your athlete be as recovered as possible going into game days. And it's not because necessarily these athletes need to compete, and I'm talking about youth, so 10U, 12U, 14U, 16 into 18U, even some of my junior hockey guys. They don't have to be 100% every game day, and they will never be 100% every game day, but you don't want to put them in a position to get hurt, especially at that 14, 15, 16, at those age groups, because the outcomes aren't nearly as important, right? My kids that are playing 20U, 20U hockey, junior hockey, they've got to perform because they're still trying to get to the next level. These kids that are 14, 15, 16 years old, their stats don't matter all that much right now. So they don't have to be 100%. You just have to make sure that they're not so fatigued that you put them in a position to get hurt on the field of play. Kind of to piggyback off that, the need to perform and practice it in games, right? So we're still thinking long-term development here. We have to dig into these athletes like at least a certain amount. We have to hit them with like the minimal effective dose, and we'll talk about that later on in this episode. But like they still need to be able to perform in practice in games. Like that's the whole reason they're training with you. They're not training to be power lifters. They're not doing their sport kind of as a bonus. They're with you to get better at their sport. So you've got to allow enough energy in the tank to kind of devote towards skill development and playing on the field of play. And then, the sport, kind of to go back to what I was talking about, having to undo the day, right? Different sports are going to need different things. A football player's practice, depending on the positioning that they play, is going to be a lot different than a hockey player's practice, which is going to be a lot different than a basketball player's practice. There's a lot of different stimulus that they go through on the field of play that don't necessarily match what the other is doing, and you have to take that into consideration. So, like, for example, with and I'll go back to hockey because it's easy for me. There's going to be like a lot of kind of frontal plane movement here, so like side to side, right? Hockey stride is a side to side action. All force vectors are going to the side. Foot's only ended up behind you because your hips are moving forward, right? So we don't need to spend nearly as much time in that frontal plane. We'd be a lot better off spending more time in the transverse plane and in the sagittal plane. So it's just kind of something to think about, understanding the demands that they're going through on the field of play and the movement qualities as well. All right, so now that they're in season as well, we want to get as far away from sports-specific training as humanly possible, right? They're getting plenty of that stimulus on the field of play. They don't need loaded versions of that in the gym. So when we're talking about like different movement qualities and your movement selection within your training, during the in-season work, we need to really be mindful of those things. There's a guy I worked with when I was working with USA Hockey by the name of Pete Friesen, right? He was a strength and conditioning coach for the Carolina Hurricanes and the Hartford Whalers for like 20 years. Dude's an absolute legend, but he actually, it kind of made a lot of sense when he talked about guys wanting to be on the bike during the season. First off, and I've always kind of had this in mind, it's a horrible position to be in. You're in a hinged position as an athlete on the field of play, as a hockey player, and then we're going to put ourselves in a hinged position for some level of conditioning. I think we're going to end up in a position where we're overusing the hip flexors, not to mention when you're on a bike, as you get tired, it's less push and you're more pulling up with your foot. So when you're pulling up with your foot, it becomes very hip flexor heavy, and that's kind of not what we want to do. Our hip flexors are already getting plenty of stimulus on the field of play. You're wearing a boot on the ice, which is kind of like putting ankle weights on. I know they've gotten lighter over the course of the past like 10, 15 years, but it's still heavier than like a shoe would be. So you can think of skating on the ice, and every single stride you're essentially doing like a knee raise or a leg raise with an ankle weight on. So what he did, and what he kind of turned me on to, was taking the straps off the pedals, right? So if you take the straps off the pedals, the only thing that they can do on the bike is push down. They can no longer pull up. So while you may not be able to talk them out of getting onto the bike, right, you can at least put them in the best possible position to not exacerbate any movement dysfunction we're creating while on the field of play. All right, I think what other sports? Football, right? Football is played mostly in the sagittal plane. Right, we're going straight ahead here. It wouldn't be the worst idea in the world to include during the season a little bit of frontal plane movement, right? Because they're not getting a ton of that. So if you can give them that quality, we can create a more well-rounded athlete, and we can kind of make strides and get stronger and stronger and stronger and keep our hips healthy throughout the season. And again, like I said before, with hockey players, you would want to hit more sagittal plane work because they're getting plenty of that frontal plane work. Hopefully that makes sense. You also want to make sure that we are not loading movements that look like what they're doing on the field of play. We do not want to make it sports specific from that perspective. And if you are a strength coach, or if you're an athlete and you have a strength coach that is doing these things, you need to stop, because you're going to end up with overuse injury a lot faster than you would had you not included those things. Another sport to to be mindful of is basketball, right? So we're talking about ground contacts. These guys are sprinting up and down the field, up and down the court. They're jumping a lot, all right? It's probably not the best idea in the world to hit them with a lot of plyometrics off the field of play. Focusing on strength and even some like loaded barbell power type movements would probably be a lot better for them. Another thing to keep in mind here is we want to minimize the eccentric work. So things like Nordic hamstring curls and eccentric focused RDLs, because it's going to fatigue the athlete. Yes, these are great strength builders, but they're also going to fatigue the athlete and put them in a position to get hurt on the field of play when they can't decelerate the way we need to. Fatigued hamstrings probably account for like the vast majority of non-contact ACL tears on the field of play. I don't know that there's any like data to support that, but just from a strength coach's mind and my perspective, I'd be willing to bet that that's a big part outside of movement dysfunction. That's a big part of why we see so many non-contact ACL tears in youth sports today. All right, so try to think when we're talking sports specific. It almost has to be like the anti-sport. It can't be what they're doing on the field of play because they're getting plenty of that. It needs to be focused on the movement qualities that they're not getting on the field of play and the stimuli that they're not getting on the field of play. And as weird as that sounds, that's what sports-specific training is during the season. All right, so next thing on the list, we're going to go over exercise selection. So during the season, probably focus more so on compound movements. We say this a lot as strength and conditioning coaches, more bang for your buck, but that's not really why. Hitting these compound movements will, I guess you could say, give you more bang for your buck, but you're going to have to perform less volume in the gym to be able to get like the same out of that athlete. So we're talking about doing a squat versus doing like a knee extension or a leg curl. Keep those compound movements as part of like your main lifts, right? So talking a squat variation of some kind, a bench variation of some kind, like a horizontal row of some kind or a variation, and like a hinge of some kind. That needs to be like your main movement every single time. Rarely introduce new movements too. Now, when we're talking about like acquiring strength, like legitimate strength, we do need to kind of rotate these movements in and out. But you don't want to introduce like brand new movements all that often throughout the season. So what happens is when we perform certain movements, we adapt to them. And so it takes less out of us. Our body gets a little bit more just like physically adapted to it. So we don't get as sore. And you've probably felt that at some point during your life if you've spent any time in the gym. You do the same lift for like a month, you're on a 4-week wave or whatever, and you stop feeling nearly as sore probably a week or two into it because your body's adapted to that movement pretty well. And then you introduce new movements, and what happens? Boom, you're like crippled. So with these athletes having to play, right, they have to go out onto the field to play for practice and games. We don't want to be introducing a ton of new movements all at once. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't do any, but as you go through your season, try to like place your movement selection where like, every other week, maybe it's like a new movement, like one new movement within that given lift. So you're going to hit those different movements, for 4 weeks in a row, but like you can include a new one through that rotation every week, and I think your athletes are going to be okay. But what you don't want to do is go from like, all right, well, we're squatting, then we got a barbell RDL, we're going to do reverse hyper, we're going to finish off with some sled work, and then the next week do like a 45-degree lunge, a drop step lunge, a single leg dumbbell RDL, because those are all brand new movements, and it's absolutely going to cripple your athlete. So you want to rarely introduce these new movements. And like I said, that doesn't mean that you can't do it. You just want to be like very selective as to when you do it. Be mindful of what your athletes are already getting on the field of play. I know I already kind of talked about that, but I'm kind of noting this section about it. Don't give them so much of what they're already doing. And that's not just from a movement perspective. That's from an everything perspective. If they are conditioning Like if you've got a football coach or a hockey coach or a basketball coach that thinks that team needs more conditioning and they're doing a lot of that on the field of play, do not include that in your training. They're getting plenty of that. They're going to need some other qualities, and you've got to make sure that, you're not kind of overdoing what they're already doing. Chances are, if they're conditioning, their sport coach is already overdoing it, so you don't want to add to that. I would say this gets lost on a lot of people. Less speed training throughout the year, and kind of hear me out here. They're getting a lot of that already. The velocities that they're hitting on the field of play, right, are very high. They're a lot different than the velocities that we can mimic in the gym. Like, the focus should not be on speed training because they're getting plenty of that stimulus already, right? So, like, these physiological adaptations are no different than the movement adaptations. We don't want to just hammer on, like, what they're already getting. Like, we want to give them some of the things that they're not. That's going to be what keeps them on the field of play all year. So if they're getting a ton of speed training already, right? If you've got, like, for instance, there's a junior hockey coach. I work with some of the kids. They're about a mile down the road. They do these, like, high volume sprints every Wednesday. And so I really can't focus a whole lot on speed with them because I'll end up crippling them by the end of the season because they're already getting so much high volume, high velocity work that we have to kind of more so focus on strength and put some of that speed work to the side, at least in the lower extremity. So, like, you don't want to give them what they're already getting from a movement perspective, right? And you don't want to give them what they're getting from, like, a stimulus perspective either. All right, so next on the list is frequency. How often do we want to train? And it really depends. They're getting somewhat of a stimulus on the field of play, so they don't need nearly the volume or frequency that they're getting during the off season and into the preseason, but they do need something. For the vast majority of my athletes in season, if we're not like very low training age, just developing a base level of strength, we're probably 2 to 3 days a week, and that's going to be contingent on how many games they're playing. If they're playing a sport that has, football is relatively easy to program for and deal with because at high school football, they're playing games on Fridays, right? Nothing changes. It's always Friday, so you've always got that kind of week to plan. With those guys, you may be able to, depending on like how well the coach does things, you may be able to get them in 3 days a week. With my hockey guys down here, they play every other weekend unless they're playing a tournament. So I've got a good amount of time to program for, and it makes it a little bit easier. Now you've got baseball, basketball, soccer. They play games sporadically throughout the week, so it's going to really depend on how many games they're playing that week, what days they're playing. Are they traveling to play? There's a lot of things that come into that need to be taken into consideration when you talk about frequency. But I would say no fewer than 2 days a week. Because that's what they're going to need from a stimulus perspective. And I would say not to have them be 2 days in a row. I work with these kids and some of these parents, like that's all they have. It's like they can come in Monday and Tuesday, and then like the rest of their week is just booked out with skills training, with games, with practice, all that stuff. So we kind of take what we can get. But if you could, like, best case scenario, you got an athlete that's playing a tournament on a weekend, get them Monday and get them Wednesday. Right on Monday, we can do an upper extremity push and a lower extremity hinge. And then on Wednesday or even Thursday, we could get a upper extremity pull and a lower extremity like squat pattern push day. So frequency is going to depend on how many practices they have, what kind of practices they have, when they play games, how many games they play, how often they're playing. Like, there's a billion things that you're going to have to consider, but I would say like a good rule of thumb would be not to have them lift within 36 hours of competition if there's somebody who's already got like a relatively decent training age. It doesn't have to be a high training age, but just somebody who's been in the gym for at least a little bit of time, and they're not going to be crippled for like 3 days when they get done with like a very light lift. So 36 hours prior to competition, and in all honesty, a lot of these kids can lift the day after game. So don't feel like, don't get in this habit of, they need this rest from this game. Not necessarily. There's things that you can do as a strength coach or a sports performance coach that can like absolutely mitigate a lot of the risk associated with lifting the day after a game. All right, so frequency, 2, if you're really lucky, 3 days a week. If they're playing 2 games, 3 games, 4 games in a tournament on the weekend, maybe peel back and give them 2 days that week. But outside of that, like shoot for 3, or I guess shoot for 2 and pray for 3. All right, next on the list, we're going to talk about loads, intensities, and volumes. So during the season, the volume, for me at least, with most of the athletes that I work with, gets scaled way back. During the off season, we take a little bit more liberties as far as their volume is concerned. There's a lot more finisher type work. There's a lot more higher volume work because we are trying to kind of increase that work capacity ceiling, or I guess increase their work capacity so we can push that strength ceiling. But during the season, we can't take those kind of same liberties. So the volume gets scaled way back. The intensities, in my opinion, don't have to shift all that much. We can stay between that 75 and 85, 90 every now and then and still be more than okay. We can still develop strength by working at those intensities. With the dynamic effort work, I'd say we are between 40 and 50%, and that gets scaled back quite a bit because, again, like I said earlier, they're getting plenty of that speed stimulus on the field of play. We don't have to hammer that too much. We do some, but just not all that much because they need the other qualities like strength and a little bit of volume for growth. So we work, so with the dynamic effort work, it would be 40 to 50, which makes it like 65 to 75%. With our modified max effort work, or you could call it even repeated effort work, we work between 75 and 80, every now and then 90. If we're really like having a little bit of a stretch without having a whole lot of competition, we can push up to 95% or, try to push for a new PR. But the volume, we're less than 100 reps 99% of the time. We only need maybe 4 or 5 movements total, right? That's not including like our CNS prep. That's including like actual like lift, iron type movements. But what we do is kind of keep a lot of those like compound movements, right? So obviously keeping the squat pattern of some kind, a hinge pattern of some kind, a horizontal pull pattern of some kind, a push pattern of some kind. And we take a lot of the unilateral work or like the single limb exercises and we put them into the warm up, right? So I can stay with, like, let's say we go through our active dynamic warm up. Then we get into our movement prep and our mobility work. Then we get into like our actual, like, I guess you could call this more movement prep because we are dealing with the movement patterns that we'll use within the lift. We do a lot of that in the warm-up. So I'm talking about single leg dumbbell reverse lunges, step ups, step downs, even like Nordic hamstring curls and reverse hypers. A lot of that work can be done at a very low intensity in the warm-up, and you're going to knock a lot of that out, and they're still going to be very fresh for their main movement, which is going to probably take the lion's share of their energy away. So you do your 80 warm-up, get your mobility work in, do your movement prep, then hit your CNS prep, and by the time you got to your main movement, you're probably 25 minutes in, right? You hit your main movement, and then everything else is just like, we get through it. It doesn't matter all that much. We've done what needs to be done. The rest of this is kind of icing on the cake. We've spent the energy where it needs to be spent, and now we can move on, right? So that low intensity, low load work is done for a lot of my athletes before we get into the lift. And I'm going to do another episode of this podcast probably in a week or two talking about warm-ups and how, there needs to be this shift in warm-ups, like the gatekeepers of the warm-up, want things done a certain way. And I've had so much success kind of varying from that, and we'll talk about that. But during the season, loads go slightly down, but the volumes get dropped drastically because they're getting so much volume on the field of play. So like when you're in season, don't think, all right, well, everything needs to be light, so the volume has to be higher so that we can get this stimulus. Not true at all. The loads don't have to be overly light. The volume absolutely should not be overly high, especially in the lower extremity. You can get away with some of that in the upper extremity, especially with upper extremity pulling. like horizontal pulling, like row variations. You can get away with like higher volume stuff, but as far as the lower extremity work goes, don't do sets of 12 each, 10 each with lunge variations and single leg dumbbell variations and step up variations, because the load isn't going to be heavy enough to really accomplish what we're trying to do, and you're going to fatigue them to the point where A, it's going to be hard for them to compete on the field of play, and B, you put them in a position to get hurt. All right, so to summarize that, loads still stay like high moderate to low high, all right, but the volumes go way down somewhere, even less than 100 reps, less than 90 reps on a lot of the heavier lifting days that we have. So now we've talked about like loads, intensities, frequency, kind of all the X's and O's as far as programming and training goes. Now we're going to kind of dive into our higher training ages versus our lower training age athletes. So for our lower training age athletes, we are still developing strength. So there still needs to be like a little bit of overreaching, or like a good amount of overreaching rather. They're typically not strong enough yet to really put them in a position to get hurt on the field of play or not be able to perform yet. So you can keep those intensities a little bit higher. I know a lot of strength coaches or personal trainers would tell you, it's the opposite of that. But in reality, most of these kids don't know how to strain yet. And they're not strong enough for that load to be so detrimental to them that they're going to struggle on the field of play or possibly get injured, right? Your higher training age athletes, you're looking, again, I said I hate that word maintenance, but I guess that's the easiest way to say it, or like some moderate gains in strength and all that. Now, it's going to be really hard for your athletes to gain weight and gain size and put on mass during the season. Not impossible, but it's very hard. And in reality, like, that shouldn't be your goal. That should be a byproduct of the training that you do. They should get bigger just as a byproduct of trying to get stronger and more powerful. The lower volume and higher intensity seems to work well for my in-season athletes who have a higher training age. I have guys and gals that PR during the season. It's not all that often, but we do because again they're able to, because we put them in the best possible position to be able to do so. I've yet to, and knock on wood, I've yet to have a soft tissue non-contact injury during the season with a single one of my athletes, and I think that's just because of the way that we're able to program and put them in good positions. So with your lower training age athletes, you can keep those intensities a little bit higher, right? As long as they're proficient in the movement, we can dig into them a little bit more because A, they lack the ability to strain, and B, those loads aren't so heavy that it's going to be impossible for them to recover from. And your higher training age athletes, like, you can keep the intensities like moderate high to low high. They'll be able to PR from time to time, but you're thinking more for those guys and gals. It's more triage, especially like at the professional and collegiate. I guess at the collegiate level, it's a crapshoot, but at the professional level and the Olympic level, it's mostly triage. You're trying to make sure that athlete can get back on the field to play 2 days from now. So there's not a whole lot of ability to dig into them. With the younger kids, the high school, even at the university level, we can actually get some gains out of them during the season, even those with the higher training age. But it all depends, right? Your population of athlete and clientele is going to differ from mine, and that's if you're working in the pros, you probably know what you're doing. Again, you understand that it's triage for the most part, and all the gains that they made during the off season need to be quote unquote maintained. If you have lower training age athletes like the majority of mine, you're going to be able to dig into them a little bit more. And that kind of brings me to my next point. There's this thing called the minimal effective dose, and that's where we have to live during the season. So in the off season, we can have some of these sessions every now and then where we overreach quite a bit, and then we just have to reel them back in after that. We don't have the leeway to be able to do that during the season. You have to think the minimal effective dose to get them to where they're trying to go. And what that means is we have to do the least amount of work that's going to move the needle forward. Right, so if that means training at 75% for like 20 total reps, or let's say, 20 total reps could probably get you there. That's what we do. If it means training at 85% for 10 reps. That's what we do. Like, that's the least amount of work that you can put them through that's going to move the needle. And, I think too many strength coaches and personal trainers and sports performance coaches live in this world of like high volume beatdown because of that instant gratification that your clientele get that keeps them coming back. But if you can make them stronger and faster and better recovered throughout the season, like, they're going to keep coming back. So, think less volume, more intensity, not like a ton of intensity, but more intensity, and it's going to put them in a great position. So that's all I got for you this week. So to sum things up, higher loads and intensities, or moderate high loads and intensities, lower volume. Make sure that we're tackling the right movement patterns, that you're giving those athletes the things that they're not getting on the field of play. Make sure we're undoing the damage that the field does to them, and you'll have success during the season. It doesn't have to be this crazy programming. Most of the programming that works during the season and in general is boring. So don't feel like the volume has to be crazy, that you've got to do all these, high volume finishers all the time. Hit the basics, do them well, make sure the volume's moderate, make sure the intensity is on the kind of mid-higher end, and you'll have success throughout the season.